like a good break and a pause and a reset to finish out this school year, because I know it's been challenging for teachers, it's been challenging for our students, and I just appreciate each and every one of you for what you have done this school year for under these challenging circumstances for our students, because I know it hasn't been easy. So I just wanted to say that from the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I want to just say a couple of things about this session, because I really want you to feel like if you have a question, to put it in the chat. You can also, raise your hand and unmute yourself. We have, a fairly small group, and so, discussion and it is always important. And I've built some time in for that, if we want to do that. So the session today is moving beyond multicultural education, promoting equity in education. And again, just welcome, like, Elizabeth said who I was. And so I'm just very grateful to be here. So I just wanted to start out on some reflection questions. And obviously these aren't questions for you to answer right now, but just to reflect on as we, are more focused, and rightfully so, on equity and justice in education, about how we provide services to culturally diverse children and families. So just thinking about how you can better support and serve culturally diverse children and families in the communities in which they live. And, in what ways can you create learning environments that support and build positive racial and ethnic identity for children of color? And what do you need to become an equity-minded practitioner? What is your school system, your classroom? What does it need to be more inclusive of diverse families and children? And then, thinking about the barriers, what barriers exist that prevent you or your school or your organization or, your school district from being more inclusive and equitable, because there are a tremendous number of barriers, both large and small, that prevent equity and justice in education. So just being really intentional and thinking about those things. So first wanted to start talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, because there's a tremendous focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity right now, which is good. But, at the Educational Equity Institute, we don't think that that goes far enough in addressing the systemic inequities in education. But we have to have a good understanding of these terms, because sometimes they're used interchangeably and they're not interchangeable. And they actually build on one another. So when we're thinking about diversity, this includes, but is not limited to, all these different factors such as race, ethnicity, language, physical ability, learning styles. And so this just means that a wide range of people within the community, within the school, are represented in a certain setting. And so then we can move into inclusion. And when we move into inclusion, this is when we are bringing those diverse voices into processes and activities and decision making in a way that shares power and ensures equal access to opportunities and resources. So not only are those people represented, but their voices are, the power is shared and their voices are authentically heard. And so when we have diversity and inclusion, then we can move into equity. And that's just the guarantee of holistic treatment and access and opportunities and advancement for all, while also striving together, collectively striving together, to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of any group. And so it's really important to understand those distinctions, because, in this current climate of addressing equity and justice in education, it's really important that we understand these differences and have a shared terminology if we're going to work together towards meaningful change. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the current disparities in education. And these are like Elizabeth said, my background is in early childhood, but I also was a kindergarten teacher. That was my first job out of college, was a kindergarten teacher. And so when we're talking about the current inequities, both in K-12 and in early childhood, but these data are for K-12. So we're talking about equity in suspension and expulsions. So we know from the data that Black boys, and these are old data, so but they've remained very consistent over the years. Like this is very consistent with early childhood data as well. So Black boys are up to 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white boys. And we also know that Black girls are up to 6 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white girls. And this is even after for controlling for the type of school and poverty level. And so we recognize that implicit bias plays a key role in these suspensions and expulsions, because the research tells us that Black boys, Black boys and Black girls will be suspended for less offense, more how do I say it? Like less offensive than white children. And so, and it's very subjective. So it's like being disrespectful, or children are judged by how they walk, and those lead into perceptions about behavior. Whereas white boys and white girls are more likely to not be judged by those things, and they're more likely to be suspended or expelled for things that are not super objective, that are more objective, like bringing a weapon to school or bringing drugs to school and those kinds of things. And when we're talking about behavior in K-12 in particular, it's like we develop these zero tolerance policies. And so these zero tolerance policies actually grew out of the broken windows theory and the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994. And so what happened is that school districts started disciplining really minor infractions, like the ones I was talking about, like being disrespectful and those kinds of things. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to discipline these minor infractions to prevent more serious behaviors from occurring in the future. But what happened is there was this overall negative effect on students, particularly for Black students, because of the role of implicit bias. And so, like I said, Black students are more likely to be suspended or expelled for very subjective offenses, and very minor offenses as well. And so the other area that I want to talk about is the identification for special education. And so, there's national, state, and local over-identification and very specific categories in special education, including, mental retardation and emotional disturbance. And so what we've found is that Black children are more likely to be placed into special education when it's, when the guidelines are based on student, but by teacher referral, right? And so, and we also know there are 2 key ways where special education, there are disparities. There are disparities on identification, so over-identification, and access, and less access to high quality early special education services. So with the identification for special education, Black children are more likely to be placed in more segregated or restricted settings than white children. And this again goes back to that implicit bias. And so these are just some of the issues with over-identification. So we know that once students are receiving special education services, they tend to remain in those special education classes. And so if a child is referred for special education and they're placed in a self-contained classroom, they're very likely to stay there. And so what happens is they're encountering limited and less rigorous curriculum in these settings. And another thing that happens in self-contained classrooms for children, Black children who have been identified to be put in those places, is that there can be lower expectations, which can lead to diminished academic and post-secondary opportunities. And we also know that students in special education programs, they have less access to academically able peers. So it's really important that we understand that when children are placed in special education, these restrictive environments, that they're less likely to have access to children who are placed in regular education. And this disproportionality, it contributes to significant racial separation because of the disproportionality related to over-identification. And so then we have under-identification for gifted education. And so data from the US Department of Education show that Black and Hispanic students make up 40% of public school students, but they make up only 26% of students enrolled in gifted programs. And we also know that Black students and Black teachers' classrooms, they have this almost the same probability of being assigned to gifted services as otherwise similar white students. And so when Black children have Black teachers, they're more likely to be referred for gifted education. Um, and we also know that Black students in white teachers' classrooms are identified for gifted services only about a third as often. So that same race teacher student dynamic is incredibly important. And part of this is because of special education. Because of implicit bias. So these are some of the reasons for under-identification, that we have under-resourced schools and we have less access to high quality education. A lot of times this gifted education, and I know this isn't the case in my children's school district, and I think probably North Carolina wide, but in a lot of states, identification for special education is based on teacher referral. And then we also know that children are evaluated based on a school district definition of gifted. And so in all but one state, identification of giftedness is academic achievement. And so when we're thinking about that, that's going to create clear disparities in identification for gifted education just because of the standards that we use. And then another area we need to talk about is in equity and instructional practices. So the research has shown that students of color tend to experience lower quality instructional practices than their white peers, and they generally experience lower quality activity settings and receive fewer rich, stimulating experiences than white children. And this is a real problem when we're talking about instruction in the classroom and the quality of instruction that Black children are receiving. And then finally, we also need to talk about equity and teacher-child relationships. So there's a lot of research that shows that Black children tend to have relationships with their teachers that are less positive than those formed with white children. And Black children have more negative and conflictual relationships with teachers than white children. And so when we're thinking about the importance of teacher-child relationships and the learning and development of children, this is one key area that we need to focus on. And so we've all heard of the school to prison pipeline. And then, then we started referring it to as the preschool to prison pipeline. But really what we have is a cradle to prison pipeline because of the structural barriers that are in place within our society that have prevented equal access to healthcare, to jobs, to good schools, to high quality early childhood education. So what we really have is this cradle to prison pipeline. And this was coined to describe the disproportionate number of Black children who are suspended and expelled from school. And so what we know about these exclusionary practices is that when children are suspended or expelled, they're missing out on education. So there's an interruption in their education. When a child is suspended or expelled, there's increased likelihood that they're going to be suspended or expelled another time or multiple times. We also know that these exclusionary practices are related to later academic achievement and school dropout. And they also are more likely to enter the criminal justice system. And so because of all of these factors of over-identification for special ed, under-identification for gifted education, teacher-child relationships, and instructional practices, we have created this cradle to prison pipeline in combination with all of the structural barriers within our society. And so when we're talking about current equity work, it's really grounded in colorblindness. And colorblind racism is that there's this belief that there's no racial hierarchy, that racism does not exist within our society. And what it does is it fails to consider the permanence of race's role within our nation's institutions. And for a long time, many of us thought we were living in a post-racial society. But what happened is that, what happens is racism morphs to the current demands of society. And so, with the Jim Crow era, it was very, very overt racism. And then, we had the civil rights movement where we moved into this colorblind ideology, this colorblind way of seeing our society. But then there's been this reemergence that has shown us that we do not live in a post-racial society, that racism is deep and it's endemic within our nation's institutions. And so the other thing is, like, when we are grounded in colorblind ideology, and colorblind ideology is just that, we don't see color, or I believe all children are equal, and those kinds of things. This leads us to implement band-aid interventions or approaches. And so this is when we implement a literacy intervention, and when we don't have improved academic outcomes with that literacy intervention, then we implement another literacy intervention, or we implement another math intervention or a social emotional intervention. And what's happening is we're not addressing the root causes, we're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. And so this current equity work, being grounded in color blindness, it sustains white as the norm, and it ensures this cultural frame of reference for all behaviors, all interactions, and all experiences, as well as the establishment of policies and practices. So if we're going to address equity in education, we need to have a paradigm shift. And so we are entrenched currently in what I call first generation equity work. And this first generation of equity work is really it's this reliance on implementing these isolated or band-aid interventions. It's based upon a blame the victim mentality, that Black children and families are at risk and in need of fixing. There's some paternalism that goes along with that. And then there's this unwillingness to identify and address root causes. And so with first generation equity work, it does make us feel like we're doing something meaningful, because we're putting these interventions in place. We're putting this literacy intervention in place to improve third grade reading levels. We're putting this math intervention in, we're putting the social emotional intervention in, but we're not addressing the root causes of these issues to begin with. And so this allows us to stay in a place of comfort, because we're not having hard conversations about what exactly is at the root of the academic and the achievement and opportunity gaps. And what it does is, this first generation equity at work, it maintains those opportunity and achievement gaps, because we're not addressing the root causes of the issues. And so what really needs to happen now is we need to move into this second generation equity work. And this is borrowed from a chapter in the Handbook of Early Intervention by Michael Guralnick. Sorry, I was going to see the chat and I advanced. Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth that was putting in the chat. Okay, so this term, second generation equity work, I borrowed it from Michael Guralnick, who wrote this chapter in the Handbook of Early Intervention in 1993. And he wrote this when early intervention was in the midst of a rapid period of change. And I really feel like that's where we are right now with current equity work, because everybody wants to focus on equity, and rightfully so, but we have to do it in the right way, or it's going to end up being another Band-Aid on the problem. And so what he did is, he really wanted to move people away from superficial analyses regarding the effectiveness and services and supports for young children with disabilities. And he wanted to push researchers and policymakers to ask more specific questions and develop a more nuanced understanding about how to meet the needs of young children and their families. And so that's what we really need to do now with our equity work. We need to move away beyond Band-Aid interventions, and we need to move into ask more specific questions about why these inequities continue to exist, and we need to develop a more nuanced understanding about how to address them through the implementation of new policies and practices. And so if we're going to move into second generation equity work, it requires a unique commitment and determination. And so, not discounting the effectiveness of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, because they do serve a purpose, but they're not going to address the root causes and the systemic racism that exists within the educational system. And so if we're going to, move into addressing those root causes, it's going to take unique commitment and determination, because they are deep. And so we're going to have to let go of the traditional Band-Aid approach, and we're going to have to push through some discomfort, because there's nothing comfortable about equity work when we're doing it the right way. To understand those structural barriers and roots causes, as well as our own role in perpetuating the disparities. And so because of that, we have to have a keen understanding of how our systems were set up and how they've morphed over time. And so these are just some equity efforts so far. You know, we've relied on punishment versus discipline. I think we live in a very punitive society. We don't live in a healing society. And so we really need to move into the more emphasis on healing. Again, this focus on implementing isolated interventions. And we continue to implement educational practices that are based on white European values. And then I just put this in here, the new emphasis on trauma-informed care. And so I think that, you know, the danger of this is that, you know, some people see the trauma-informed care as a Band-Aid, or I mean, not a Band-Aid, as a check the box. Like I went through
the last couple of days.
Oh,
I
good.
went through this training. I went through this training, and now I can implement trauma-informed care. But when we're doing true trauma-informed care, it's like everybody who enters that building, there's an emphasis on healing everybody that enters that building. And so, and then there's siloed efforts within communities where you see different groups doing different things and not working together as a collective. And I see in the chat, I can see where culturally responsive teaching can help with tearing down perpetuating stereotypes and using white norms on all cultures. Yes, thank you. All right, so when we're talking about, and I promise we're going to get to the strategies. So we have to have this background information first, though. So when we're talking about achieving equity in education, our focus on outcomes is important, but we also must examine the root causes of the inequities, including what they look like in everyday practice. We need to work to eliminate policies and practices and attitudes that perpetuate disparate outcomes. And then we need to enact policies and practices that address the root causes of the inequities and promote better outcomes. So now we're going to shift into actually, you know, what does this look like in education? So when we're talking about a white European ideology, and I think that was in the chat, this white is the norm. And so when we use this analogy of a tree, we see that at the roots of the tree is this institutional racism, where we have policies and practices. And those roots then lead up into whose cultural norms and values and beliefs are used to determine what education should be, what education should look like. And it also grows into implicit biases and how they play out in the classroom. And all of this then leads into the growth of these disciplinary practices, instructional practices, and teacher-child relationships that are really based upon a white European ideology about education. And so right now what we have is we have a cultural disconnect between home and school. And so we have to come to a common understanding that European American culture, and I know this is just a broad stroke of all of this, but it's like when we do our trainings, we dive real deep into this stuff because it's really important to understand the roots of where all of these things came from. But this European American culture, it greatly influences education, and it serves as a basis for content of teacher education programs that are often based upon white American European theorists. And we're not saying that those theorists are not important. You know, Erik Erikson is my favorite white male theorist, but it's taking into account that we need to have other viewpoints and from other cultures be incorporated into what education should look like. And so when we're looking at the cultural disconnect, we know that the majority of teachers are white and monolingual. They often lack experience and exposure to children from diverse backgrounds. And this is not, you know, saying it's the fault of the teachers. It's just we live in a very segregated society. You know, we're often aware of we're unaware of our white privilege. We often view children from other cultures from a deficit lens, and that's not at the fault that we absorb just based on what we're taught and our student teaching experiences. We absorb all of those things, and we might not be comfortable talking about race. And I say we because I'm a white person. And so when we have this cultural disconnect, culturally diverse children are less likely to have their academic and social needs met. They are less likely to have their cultural experience and backgrounds affirmed and validated. They're less likely to have their cultural qualities honored and respected. And they are more likely to be measured by white middle class standards. And so when we're talking about this cultural disconnect, this whiteness, which is white is the norm, has dictated what children learn, how children should learn, and what high quality instruction looks like. And so we come to a common understanding that children of color, they bring their own experiences and their socialized patterns of behavior that are often not valued in educational settings. And so what we do is we expect children of color to morph to this whiteness within classrooms rather than altering our programs to fit all children. And children of color are sometimes penalized when they don't conform to these standards. And we see this in the suspensions and expulsions in particular. And we're looking at the cultural disconnect in instruction. Again, instruction is based on a European American paradigm that has defined appropriate socialized academic behaviors. And then, we develop curriculum instruction that mirror the majority society and often reflect the experiences of middle income suburbia. And so, in our trainings, we really dig into this concept of whiteness. And when we're talking about whiteness, we're actually talking about affluent whiteness within American society. That's what when we're talking about what we're striving towards in society, it's that affluent whiteness as the norm. And when children of color do not acquire certain skills, they're deemed at risk, which is very coded language. I used to be a researcher at UNC Chapel Hill, and we used at risk in our grant applications, but everybody knew who we were talking about when we used that language. Or, non-responders, which is often used in the response to intervention framework. We refer to children as non-responders, which I think is really, deficit language. And we do this rather than critically examining the instruction and or curriculum. And so these are just some characteristics of European American culture that are sometimes hard for people to digest. I fully recognize that. And the one that we always get kind of off on a tangent about is time. And that's something that we have to deconstruct in trainings, is talking about because with white European culture, we're very clock conscious. We're concerned with being on time. And that can be incongruent with other cultures. Again, future orientation, this emphasis on the future rather than the present. And we got into a conversation about this in a recent training about, well, shouldn't we all be focused on the future? And it's like, but different cultures value these things in a different way. Yes, Patricia, I can share this PowerPoint. Can I do that, Elizabeth?
Yep, if you're willing, we'll send it out with the recording next week to everyone.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I will do that. All right. And then the other one I just wanted to focus on here briefly, because I think it's really important, is that, we live in a very individualistic society where we're focused on our individual academic attainment, our children's individual attainment, our own material success, and those kinds of things, and which can be incongruent with other cultures. And it's really important that I really believe that, because we live in such an individualistic society, that, there's this care for other that's not present. And we really need to move into a collectivism, which is more congruent with other cultures. And so these are just the differences between current and culturally responsive anti-bias practices. And I say culturally responsive anti-bias practices because it's like a combination of two sets of practices. They share common characteristics, but we've kind of put them together in one set of practices. And so this is like the typical learning environment, right? We're very rule driven, we're very conformist, we're about order, it's thing focused, we're focused on, test scores and grades. It's very hierarchical. But when we're looking at a cultural responsive anti-bias environment, it's very freedom loving. There's a lot of creativity, there's flexibility and where to learn and what to learn and how to learn it. It's people focused, and then it's democratic. And I don't mean that like everybody has the same voice and all that kind of stuff, but it's like, sorry. But when I'm talking about democratic, is that children have a say in the development of rules, or how you're going to address a topic and those kinds of things. And you're following incorporating children's experiences into the learning. And so these are just some oh, thank you. Is it Zoraida? Zoraida, thank you. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so these are just some of the principles of culture responsive anti-bias pedagogy. So what we do is we include children's cultural references in all aspects of learning, and learning takes place within the context of children's cultures. We make sure that all children are welcomed and supported and provided with the best opportunities to learn. And when we do this, this is positive for children's self-concept. And we also focus on teaching equity and social justice. And I always say, like, we're not, teaching children to take to the streets. We're just teaching children about fairness and unfairness and discrimination and how to address those when we see them. Because if we don't address those things with our children, the same issues that we're seeing in society today are going to continue. And so it's really important that we're talking with children about issues related to fairness and unfairness and discrimination. And so these are just some benefits of culture responsive and anti-bias education for all children. So it encourages a true sense of self by helping children from all cultural backgrounds engage in positive identity development. And we always say that, we've all been socialized within this racist society to behave in certain ways, to have social identities. And so we all need to engage in positive identity development so that we can, really develop authentic relationships with one another. And the other thing is that it promotes the healthy development of all children, because we're creating learning environments that are good for all children. And it prepares children for the future by helping them develop cross-cultural skills that will be needed to fully participate in society. And so I think it's by 2040, white people are going to be in the minority in our country. And so our children need the skills to really develop authentic relationships in this increasingly diverse society. And also it prevents social isolation. When we provide, experiences for children to authentically, develop relationships with children from different cultural backgrounds, they're going to feel less isolated.
Are you checking out the chat, Jenny?
Yeah, sorry, can you see me do it? No,
Yeah,
Deborah said that given that all children in general want the same things, love, attention, acceptance, I struggle to see how teachers who have a love for children cannot develop positive relationships with children of color. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying this. Yeah, and Deborah, I'm not saying that's like, all teachers. That's just like what the research has told us about teacher-child relationships. So it's like, with this research, we just have to take it as information. So it's not saying that all teachers are not capable of developing positive relationships. I hope that makes sense. All right, so when we're looking at environments, and so these are just characteristics of culture responsive anti-bias practices. And I just put this up here because I think it shows us that, it can be daunting to think about implementing new practices, right? But when we look at these different categories and the characteristics, it's not much more than we're currently doing. And so it should be really easy to create environments that are, culture responsive anti-bias. And so I just want to look at some of the things in here. I don't want to cover all of them. And so, when we're looking at the environment, inviting students to learn about each other and their cultural backgrounds, recognizing the culture of students and providing a safe space. So I think this is important because we have discussions because we do historical and racial trauma trainings as well, and we talk about safety. And so when we're talking about safe and we're talking about historical and racial trauma, we might need to redefine what safe looks like within culture responsive anti-bias classrooms, just because of the ongoing racial trauma that children of color can experience on a daily basis. And we're seeing this for all cultural backgrounds right now, not just Black children, even though, Black children and families have been on the receiving end historically the most of racial trauma, but we're seeing it within the Asian community and obviously within the Latinx community as well. And so when we're looking at instruction, making sure that we're incorporating students' interests, their cultural backgrounds, because different cultures are interested in different things and different ways of learning. And so it's really important that we do that. And then when we're looking at the curriculum, addressing the contributions of diverse cultures, providing activities that mirror the students' identities, reflecting on their experiences in their communities, in their homes, and just including children's culture as a frame of reference. And when we do this, we dissolve some of those dominant white is the norm narratives. And so when we're looking at culture responsive anti-bias practices, positive identity development, instructional practices, and family partnerships. So I'm only going to focus on the first two for this session because it's just a lot of information to put in here. And so I think these are the two most important for teachers in particular to understand because they're directly related to curriculum and instruction. And so when we're talking about positive racial identity develop, we have to understand racism's effect on positive identity development. And when we do this, we come to understand that all children are negatively affected by racism. And so, I have 3 boys, 17, 14, and 10. And I talk to them regularly about race and racism and just what's going on within our society. I had a very mature, nuanced conversation with my 17-year-old this week about cancel culture. But it's like, as much as I'm talking to them about race and racism, I am fighting against socialization through the media, through friendships, through school, all of those things. And so that's how my children are negatively impacted by racism. And they're not impacted in the same way that Black children and other children of color are, but all of our children are being impacted by racism in our society, even more so right now. And I had a conversation with my son's middle school this week about, a lesson on Asian American support. And it's just understanding that our children are hearing this, they're witnessing this, and they need help processing all of what's happening in our society. Because the positive and negatives of social media are out there, but it's like my children learn a lot on TikTok, and a lot of it is really positive. They're learning a lot of stuff, but they also need help processing that. And so but we have to understand that racism causes the most undue harm to Black children. And we're talking about, all the other kids of color, like Latinx and particularly the Asian American community right now. All of that violence stems from anti-Blackness within our society. And so we have to recognize that all of that comes from this anti-Blackness that has its roots within our nation's history. And so when we're talking about racial identity, this is a collective identity with a particular racial group, and this includes the extent to which individuals use race as a reference to guide their thinking, their feelings, and their actions. And when children have positive racial and ethnic identity, it's linked to higher resilience, self-efficacy, self-esteem, grades, standardized test scores, and reduced risky behavior. And this positive racial identity can serve as a buffer for Black children against prejudice and discrimination. And so when we're talking about why this is important for all children, it's important because this is how racism affects white children. If we're not talking to our white children about race and racism, they can deny reality. It doesn't affect me, so it's not happening to me. I don't have any friends, authentic friendships with children of color, so I don't even know that it exists. It also, helps them to develop that their experience is the norm for all experiences within society, and they can begin to internalize messages of false superiority. And this doesn't necessarily happen in the home, it just happens between being socialized. And then racism affects Black children through prejudice, discrimination, and microaggressions, different learning experiences than white children. And also they can have shame and anger and rage just based on their experiences within society. And then Patricia said, I understand from the news that UNC systems are considering safeguards for admissions because white supremacy is being seen at elevated levels. Yeah, it's really not good right now. So I know this is a big slide and I'm only going to touch on a couple of different things. And of course, you're going to get these slides afterwards so you can really dig into this stuff. But, it's thinking about, I'm just going to point out some of this, some of the things on here. So what we know is that children need to establish racial and gender identity. And society teaches Black children that the dominant race is the best. But what we need to do is that we need to teach all children that all aspects of identity are valued. And just help children need to develop an appreciation of diversity. But society teaches Black children that racial stereotyping and prejudice should not be discussed. But what we need to do is teach all children that stereotyping and prejudice are hurtful. And so it's really important that, we understand that what children need to do, what society actually teaches Black children, and then what we can do to help all children work through all of this stuff and develop positive racial identities. And so just being more color aware, intentionally teaching children about race, letting Black children know that you see and value their race as an important part of who they are, and responding to children's race-related questions. Children want to talk about this stuff. Like we did a training recently and this little 4-year-old girl was talking about race, asking race-related questions every single day. And it was like, that is a child who really is begging to talk about race. And so the more that we can talk about these things with children, we're going to grow into a more positive society. And I really, believe, just with my own children and talking to other parents who have children, teenage children, that our children are going to save us from everything. So just cultivating, foster critically thinking and respectful relationships, cultivating children's empathy and ways to deal with the hurt of stereotyping, supporting children as they demonstrate awareness of stereotyping, and just engaging children in group action, helping children act together and come to a common solution about what is fair and unfair in a story or a book or, in a role play. Those kinds of things is incredibly important. And so when we're thinking about culture and cultural values, they give students frequent opportunity. We need to be able to give students frequent opportunities to share information about their lives and their cultures, and looking for ways to build bridges to students' communities in thoughtful ways. And also remembering that sometimes culture is harder to see, but no less significant. And so when we look at this, often when we think of culture, we think of language and dress and holidays and food. But really, there's so much more to culture that's more difficult to see. And thinking about, rules of conduct, attitude towards school, approaches to health and medicine, our concepts of justice, child rearing practices. So it's getting to know our children and families in an authentic way, because when we do that, it takes away judgment and also helps us infuse those cultural frames of reference into learning within the classroom. And so, when we're thinking about culture responsive teaching, we're bringing native languages into the classroom. We know that children who are learning English as a second language, they learn to read and speak English faster when their home languages are represented in the classroom. Just helping children understand the true history of our country and also the culture, and just bringing the community culture into the classroom, and also that family involvement is so critical. And so when we're thinking about culture responsive teaching, it's really transformative because teachers are respecting the cultures and experiences of culturally diverse children, and they're incorporating those cultural values and beliefs into the daily life of the school or the classroom. And what this does is it requires teachers to create a learning environment where all students are welcomed, they're supported, and provided with the best opportunities to learn regardless of their cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And when I was a student teacher my senior year in college, and I was a student teacher in this kindergarten classroom for children with very significant behavioral challenges, and there were some children with autism in there. But I remember my practicum supervisor telling me, when you go into that classroom, I want you to take a look around and see how it looks identical to a regular kindergarten classroom. And then what message does that communicate to the families about themselves and their children? And I think about, when we're thinking about culture responsive teaching, when a child and a family comes into the classroom, do they see themselves represented in the classroom through the books that we choose, the pictures that are on the walls, the materials we use? Because when we do that, when children and families of different cultures come into the classroom and they see themselves represented there, they feel like they and their children matter. And so I think that's an important point that we need to understand when we're thinking about creating welcoming and supportive environments. We need to create environments where children and families see themselves within the classroom. And so, again, just including children's native language in the classroom environment. Um, Teachers become more knowledgeable about the history and the culture of the students in their care, and also acknowledging the contributions of people of color. I remember, well, yesterday when I was talking to my middle schoolers, um, I'll get to your question there in a second. I was talking to my middle schoolers guidance counselor about they had included they had talked to they had every day in Black History Month they had talked about stuff, and like the Black students in the middle school were like, but we want to learn more about just athletes. And so, thinking about that, and so some examples of culture responsive classroom atmosphere, especially like, okay, so think about the posters that you have in your classroom. I think it's really important, like especially for younger classrooms, that it's really important to have pictures of, if you have like pictures in your reading area where all your books are, of people reading together, families reading together. I think this one is very important, is including pictures of children of varying skin tones from very light to very dark, because oftentimes in classrooms we have very light-skinned Black children and families on the walls. But making sure we have posters that represent, because there is an issue with historically that light-skinned Black children and families are more valued than dark skin. And so, yes, and then books written by Black authors about children of color where the children are the protagonists and not just some side character. It's including those kinds of things in the classroom that are incredibly important, that help children develop positive identities. Does that answer your question a bit?
That does. Thank you so much.
Sure, no problem. And then, just in building trust and authentic family relationships, there's often mistrust from other cultures about schools just because of their own experiences within the school system. So being aware of that and just meeting parents where they are and building authentic relationships from that. And just building strong ties between the school and the cultural community where the school is located. And then just look for ways to increase, relevance, thinking about students' background knowledge when introducing a new topic, or, using inquiry-based learning approach that invites students to identify a question or a problem to solve, or designing research projects that allow students to focus on issues within their own community, because that makes it relevant to them, and that increases motivation as well. And encouraging students to present their work publicly so they can present to classmates or families or community members. And then I just want you to think about this is reflecting on culture responsive practices. Are you aware of your own cultural identity and history? I think a large part of all of this work is self-reflection. And are you aware of any biases you may hold? Because we all have biases. And I think it's important that we all work to identify our biases so we can unearth them and, prevent them from being triggered in certain situations. Do you view diversity and exceptionalities as a strength and that all children can succeed? Does your classroom provide equal representation of images and materials of diverse groups and cultures in a non-stereotypical manner? And do I treat each child, see and treat each child both as an individual and as a member of a different social and cultural group? So I think these are just important self-reflection questions for us as we move forward. And so then this is just the end that I want. This is, some takeaways, things for you to do and, moving along in your journey towards culture responsive anti-bias practices. Think about your current role as an educator. What is your role in promoting equity and why? And what is your approach? What strategies or steps are needed? And how do you hold yourself accountable for addressing these inequities? And what resources of materials are available to achieve equity? And what risks may be involved? And how do you address those risks? So I think that, take one of these or, think about your role as an educator and then think about any of these and how you can address those, in your classroom or in your school. Because I think it's really, each of us, we need more activists, and activism doesn't necessarily mean, marching in the streets or demonstrating. Activism can be simply as simple as creating a culture responsive anti-bias classroom, because in some instances that's can be deemed radical. And so, just commit to being an activist in your life in some way to promote more equitable outcomes for all children. I just, we have 3 minutes, so I wanted to see if there are any questions before we close out. And I know we only have 3 minutes.
Feel free to share in the chat, or since we're a small enough group, you can also come off mute and share that way too. And as we may have any questions, I also put the feedback form, the survey in the chat just now, mainly just to get your input on today's event, but also to get ideas from you on future topics and webinars.
So here's my contact information. If nobody has any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. If you have any questions, Elizabeth, I can send our resource guide out as well that we have.
Yeah, if you're willing to do that, that'd be great. And I can send all of that with your slides and the recording together next week.
Okay, yeah, sure, I can do that. So I'll send out this PowerPoint and I'll send out the resource guide that we've developed as well. And again, if you have any questions or, feel free to reach out anytime. I get back to people pretty quickly. So I appreciate all of you again. You guys are doing really great work and you're underpaid, undervalued. And I hope everybody has a good spring break.